Okay, so welcome everyone to our meeting today with Professor Nathan Lentz. He is a faculty at the John Jay College in New York. In addition to his research in genetics and cell biology, he is also very active in popular science writing, having done many media interviews, written many articles, and two books. So today we will talk with him about his recent book, Human Errors, but also about science writing and communication in general. Professor Lentz, welcome to our meeting and thank you for being with us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. And I'm glad we could finally make it happen. I know we had a couple of things on the calendar that didn't end up working, but I'm glad we were able to get this to work.
Yeah, we are very glad to have you here. So I will begin by asking the very standard question we ask to all science communicators, which is that what motivates you to write for the general audience?
That's a good question. I'm an educator. In addition to being a scientist, I've always been an educator. So I had my first real teaching experience when I was in college. I was a teaching assistant, and so this was like 1990, maybe 7 or 8. So I guess I've been doing this for almost 25 years now. And I taught through graduate school. I basically all my life, professional life, I've had some kind of teaching as part of what I do. And I've always really enjoyed it. So I really enjoy learning about things and then trying to teach other people. Because I feel like, none of this is worth anything if you don't share the knowledge and share what you've learned with other people. And I really enjoy being a student myself, because so I'm also always learning. I'm going to talks, I'm reading books, I'm always reading and learning. And so to participate in that from the other direction is also very meaningful to me. Um, I got into science writing more professionally almost by accident. And I wrote a couple of articles and started a blog where I was mostly just kind of my own thoughts. And it was a way to challenge myself to learn about some areas that I wasn't expert in. And and then I had a sabbatical coming up. So a sabbatical, if you're not familiar, is every 7 years. If you're an academic, if you have a tenured position at a university in the United, and this is true in the United States, I think it's true in most universities in the West. Um, every seventh year, you can take the year off of most of your responsibilities, meaning no teaching and no committee work, no administrative work, in order to focus only on research. And it's a way to, because, faculty members often have a lot of different responsibilities. And so it's a way to kind of refresh and renew your focus as a researcher, as a scholar. So like if you're in the humanities, you typically write a book during that year. If you're in social science, everyone does it differently, but in the sciences is usually you dive into either a new area or a new technique, or you sort of change the direction of your research, and you use that year to do that. So when my sabbatical came up, I didn't want to change my research focus, but what I wanted to do was write a book. I was like, and I didn't even, know what I wanted to write. So I decided that I was fascinating with how did humans get so different? Like, what's really different about humans? Because I'm interested in evolution. So how did we get so different so fast from all the other animals? And so I spent that year doing all this research on it and finding things like, our love and attachment, justice, fair play, all the things that I thought were unique to humans. And at the course of after that year, I had all this research done, and I had really, spent the whole year research and reading, and I came to the exact opposite conclusion. And that's the idea, is that humans really aren't that different. Our emotions are very much the same as other animals have. And our drives, what motivates us, what we care about, what's important to us, our social interaction. A lot of it's actually very, very similar to what happens in other animal societies. What's different is that we think about it, we contemplate, and we think about our emotions, and we think about those stuff, but we don't have any different emotions than the other animals. So I realized that's the book, is to convince people that actually our complex culture and language and everything else is really just a smokescreen of complexity. Underneath it is the same sort of simple drives and emotions that most other animals have. So that's how I got into this, and that was about 7 years ago now that I took that year. And the book came out in 2016. That was the result of that year. So it took me a couple of years to, finish writing the book, because my sabbatical was several years before that. Yeah. And then now here I am. And then I wrote another book very quickly after that. And that's the one we're here to talk about today. And what's funny is that book actually started as the last chapter of the previous book. But then my editor at the publishing house was like, first of all, your book's too long. We have to cut it anyway. And secondly, this chapter doesn't fit with the rest of the book at all. You're just trying to slam it here on the end of the book. Why are you doing that? I was like, I don't know. I just thought it was a good idea. And she said, you know what? That's a whole other book. Go write that book. And I was like, oh, okay, sure. That's the next book then. And I think she was upset because I didn't go with that publisher for the second book, even though it was her idea that I write it. But the second book was from a much bigger publishing house. I wanted to be, New York Times bestseller kind of a book. And my first book was in an academic publisher, the Columbia University Press. It's a top tier academic publisher, but it's really for a scholarly audience. It's very technical language, and it's sold well, but it's not for the masses. And so the second book, I really wanted to go with a publisher that could get my book out to, everyone. That was a really long answer. Sorry. Once I get started, I don't know when to stop.
No, that's a very interesting story, because it's always nice to know the story behind the book, how the book came about. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, you bet.
Coming back to the topic of your book, Human Errors, how would you define an error in human body?
That's a great question. And I get it. And not as often as I thought I would, but when I get it, it always opens up an interesting conversation. So what is an error for the purpose of this book anyway? An error is something about our biology that really doesn't look like it's optimized very well, and therefore requires an explanation or a closer look. So something that doesn't quite add up, match up, that doesn't make sense, or another way to say it, something that could be designed a lot better. You know what I mean? So, if you were to design the body or the mind from scratch, the kind of mistakes that you wouldn't make if you were doing it from scratch. That's kind of how I define an error. A quirk, something that just doesn't quite fit. And so that's a very broad definition. And in fact, I don't actually like the word error. I don't know if you know this, but I did not choose the title of the book. And publishers, especially those kind of publishers, they put the title on the book. And this was like the fourth title that we went through. And each time they changed it, I liked it less and less and less. So I didn't like the book at all, or the title of the book at all. But I think they're right that it seems to get people's attention, and that's their goal, is to make a flashy title that people will want to read the book. My original title for the book was Not So Perfect, meaning because what the book is really railing against is the idea that humans are the pinnacle of creation or the pinnacle of evolution. We're the most highly evolved, that all of human history or of biology is like a march towards the most perfect organism, which is us. And I really wanted to, argue against that. And so the original title was Not So Perfect. So what I was doing was emphasizing all the imperfection that we have in our bodies, and how if we were designing it from scratch, we would design a much different body than the one we have. So that's how I define an error. But any old error didn't necessarily make it in the book, because it's not like an encyclopedia of our glitches. The quirks that make it into my book are the ones that have an interesting story to tell. So some quirks really teach us something interesting, either about our past or about how our body takes shape, how our body works. And so, because I want people to enjoy the book, I want people to learn something from the book, and I want people to be able to improve their lives a little bit by reading the book. And so there's some examples that I just didn't cover because I didn't see how it was a fun story to tell, or how you could really learn something valuable from it. So it's not just, and that's why I also didn't like the subtitle of the book. They said A Panorama of Our Glitches. I was like, this is not a panorama. This is not an encyclopedia. But they didn't listen to me. Anyway, so I included as errors in the book glitches or imperfections, quirks that I think reveals something interesting, that there's something interesting to explore with it.
Just to give you a bit of background to our discussion, most of our audiences are from Bangladesh or India, so they might not have had access to your book. So that's why some of our questions might be a bit of more basic level than what you would expect from an audience.
No problem.
So what you said links to a lot of interesting questions, but just before that, if we want to go into a bit more deep, so your example of human error would be our retina being backwards from the way it's connected to the, sorry, the blood, the nerves and so on. But if we think about things like our appendix or junk DNA, which at some point was considered useless or even an error, and now scientists are discovering more and more functions of it. Would you consider that as an error in your book?
So I deliberately did not include the appendix as an example in my book because, first of all, it's been written about a lot. I just didn't want to pick something that everybody, so many people have already written about it. But also, I was very aware of some of the research about the appendix that's sort of indicating that it is beneficial. So I was like, I don't want to say too much here because in a year or two, this could already be outdated, and I just didn't need to include it. But it's interesting. The appendix is such a great story, though, because it has to do with it challenges us to think about, okay, is something good for us, but is it good for us by accident? Is it good for us by design? Is it good for us because it was evolved to be good for us? So the appendix is a great example. It's a reservoir of bacteria. We know this now, that the appendix has beneficial bacteria that live there, that especially if you have a gastritis, like a gastrointestinal infection, or really bad diarrhea, whatever, where you lose a lot of the good bacteria, you have a source to seed the new population, so that the good bacteria in your intestines can kind of grow back easily, and it can serve as a reservoir. But remember, it can have that function by accident. It doesn't necessarily need to have been evolved to do that. And one thing we know is if people who lose their appendix, who have their appendix removed, they have a tougher time on average with certain bacterial infections in their intestines, because the balance of good bacteria and bad bacteria. But it's not like a common problem, but it does happen often. But also remember, you survive an infected appendix now, but you didn't for a very long time. Humans with an appendicitis before the invention of surgery, most of them died of that. So we now say, well, the appendix does this good thing for us. Okay, but is that good thing better than the fact that some people occasionally die from it? And the only way we really know that it has a benefit is the people who have had it removed have some benefit, or have lost some benefit that it used to perform. But remember, those same people would have been dead without modern medicine, right? The only reason we know that it has this function is because the people whose lives have been saved live to tell another story. So if you've ever had appendicitis, I'm sure you're not thinking about how great it is that you have an appendix at that moment. So that's why it's not as simple as, oh, it does have this function. Yeah, it does, but it also occasionally kills you, or it would have. So anyway, there's two sides of every coin. So the appendix is a good example for how these things are never simple, and there's not an easy answer. Is it good for us? Is it not? Yeah, day to day, it does seem to help, but the automobile is very good for us, but it also kills a lot of people. So if you've lost a loved one to a car accident, your automobiles are a net negative for you in your life. So it's a difficult thing. Now, junk DNA is even more interesting because we know a lot about where it comes from. So the vast majority of so-called junk DNA comes from viral infections, and then ultimately in its original source, and then it becomes parasitic DNA that reproduces itself, and etc. We know that it causes all kinds of problems when it duplicates and crashes into other genes and all of this. However, it is also, as we're learning, a potential resource in the future for new genes, new genetic elements, new regulatory regions, new potential functions. But those are in the future. So we know that it has potential, and that potential has been realized in the past. So we have some genes and genetic elements now that function that clearly were rescued from junk DNA. Does that overcome how often a crashing parasitic DNA kills individuals as well? Again, if you die because a gene was disabled that you needed, you would not think it's a good thing that you have that junk DNA. However, the species overall is better off in the long run because we have this in our toolkit of evolution. It's kind of it's kind of like a junkyard in the sense that it doesn't do much right now, but there are parts that can be repurposed. So if you've ever gone to a junkyard with all these broken down cars, you might go in there and you can rescue a light bulb, you can rescue a battery, you can rescue nuts and bolts, you can even rescue a tire or a wheel and then use it for something else. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't junk at one point. And so whether we call it junk DNA, does this have a purpose? Is this good for us? Those are, anyone who gives you a simple answer to that question doesn't understand how complex it is. There isn't a simple question. In the long run, junk DNA is good for a species in the sense that it gives us a richer toolkit for evolution. But that takes millions of years to be realized. And along the way, it's harmful. So there's your answer. It's hard to say. But I have a whole chapter on junk DNA in the book. And honestly, it already needs updating. The book is only 2 years old, but that means I wrote it 3 years ago. It needs to be updated. If I were writing that chapter now, it would look differently. We already have learned new things. And this isn't my area of research. So I can already think of like 3 or 4 things that I would write about differently. That's what's great about doing genome science is it changes really fast.
Yes, sure. Going back to what you said about writing this book, that you wanted to show that the human body is not perfect, and given the fact that you are based in the US and your book has been so popular, you get a lot of pushback from intelligent design or creationism.
Yes, a lot. And that really surprised me because when I wrote the book, I wasn't writing it as an argument against intelligent design. I knew that some people would use it that way and that, people, but if I were to write a book that's arguing against intelligent design, I would write a very different book. I would phrase things differently. I would use different examples. I would talk much more about how these things came to be. That's not how I wrote the book. As soon as it came out, though, that's how the intelligent design community took it. And it really surprised me because I didn't think they would even notice the book, or if they noticed it, they wouldn't care. I didn't think it would be on their radar at all. I was really surprised, but they very much were very angry, and they wrote lots and lots of articles about me, about the book, and the creationist community was very upset with the book. And at first I started responding and trying to keep up with it all. And then eventually I just had to stop because it was taking all my time. Because this is what they do. They're an organization dedicated to this. This is their 9-to-5 job. Whereas this is not my job. This is something I do on the side. So I had to eventually let it go. But yeah, they really came after me, and they didn't do it kindly. They didn't say, well, this is an interesting book and we'd like to take issue. I mean, they right off the bat were insulting me and saying I don't know anything, and they were claiming that I don't know anything about biology. That's what they say. I mean, listen. Maybe they don't think I'm the smartest person in the world, but I'm a professional biologist with a PhD in the field, and I've been working, in this for 25 years. I know some things. Okay, maybe I'm not right about everything, but their rhetoric was so nasty and so insulting right from the start that it got me angry. And I wish it didn't. I wish I would have just ignored it. Although I don't know, I've had some fun lately going up against them. But it took the first 6 months or so I was dizzy because I just didn't expect it. But yeah, so now I've become a public advocate for evolutionary science, and I was not that before. So they've sort of turned me into an enemy. Whereas before I didn't care about their community very much, but now I'm one of their public enemies.
Other than the professional creationists, if you could say that, when you say to the common people that the human body is full of errors, what kind of reactions do you get?
Well, it's funny because most people most people agree. I mean, I don't know anybody who is perfectly thrilled with their body. And so, and the examples I choose in the book are all ones I think people can resonate with, that they can, I try not to think of like crazy, esoteric examples. I try to do examples that most people can identify with and agree with. And so I think most people intuitively realize that. But what I think what they get surprised about is that there's a reason, and that some of the things that we have that seem like bad design are really because we evolved in a certain way, and it was good for us at one point, and it's no longer good for us because we use our body in different ways. So that's part of it. The other thing is that the biggest surprise that people often have is they think that evolution and natural selection cleans up everything, that it fixes all the problems. And that's a misconception, even among scientists. They really, I think most scientists think that evolution is a lot more powerful than it really is. Evolution is sloppy, it's messy, it has no goals. It's kind of whoever survives, survives. It doesn't matter how perfect they are, they just are a little bit better than somebody else. And not necessarily at surviving, but at reproducing. And of course, you have to survive in order to reproduce. But sometimes you reproduce just because you're good at reproduction, and that's not necessarily good at surviving. And so there's a lot of things in the book that people are surprised about, and that I was surprised about in learning, in fact. So yeah, the general audience generally, as long as they're not creationists, tend to be both surprised and not surprised with the thesis of the book.
Before I move to the next question, I just wanted to remind our viewers, if you're on the Zoom call, you can either write your question in the chat or you can raise your hand and I'll let you ask the question. And for our viewers on Facebook, you can put your questions on the Facebook thread and ask them Professor Lents. So talking about human errors, do you think that in the future, maybe through genetic engineering or bioengineering, people would be able to design equivalent of a human body, but free of all the errors?
No, I don't, because let me put it this way. Evolution will not fix any of these problems. Now, we might fix these problems medically and with engineering. And let me take those two issues separately. So a lot of people have wondered, like, oh, are we going to continue evolving our way out of some of these errors? And the answer is no, because most of these errors aren't lethal, first of all, but also we've already found our way around them. And so evolution, if we're fixing the problems ourselves, evolution isn't brought to bear like a natural. So for example, our eyes don't work so well in a lot of different ways, but you don't live and die based on how good your eyes work anymore. I mean, even if you're completely blind, you can still make a living, you can still contribute, you can still have children. You don't die of blindness. I mean, obviously people who are blind are less likely in some parts of the world to be successful, but in many parts of the world, most parts of the world, and increasingly everywhere in the world, no matter what your physical limitations are, you can still contribute to society in a meaningful way. And so there's really no reason to think that evolution will fix any of these, because you're still reproducing. And in the old days, old days, yes, the errors would have died out with the people who had them. But we've been taking care of each other for a very long time. And that's really the theme of my book, is that this isn't just a recent thing since agriculture and civilization. Our social structure has involved a division of labor and social support for millions of years, meaning it didn't matter if your body didn't work. If you had bad eyesight, okay, you couldn't be a hunter, but you could be a gatherer, you could be a homesteader, you could care for children, you could be wise, so you could be one of the people whose wisdom was important. You could be a bureaucrat, where you help organize the community. There's lots of ways you can contribute that doesn't depend on you having good eyesight. And that's been true for a very long time in our species. We have division of labor. There's lots of ways that you can contribute. So if you're not good at this, you can be good at that. And that was when we started on the path towards this human unique thing that we have called civilization, is the idea that not everybody lives and dies the same ways. Other animals do cooperate. They absolutely do cooperate. They work together, but they all are sort of doing the same thing. They're all interchangeable for the most part. What animals don't have is a division of labor that's not genetic in any way, where you just can find and contribute any number of ways, and that's not static. You can move from place to place to place. I mean, think about how we can survive in the desert. We can survive in Alaska and the Arctic Circle. We can survive in rainforests. We can survive in grasslands. We can survive in a whole bunch of different climates. And we're not genetically adapted to those climates for the most part. We learn how to live in a different way. So when we moved north, we put clothes on. When we wandered away from the desert, we built ditches to bring the water to us. You know, we find our way around these problems so that our body doesn't have to adapt. And that social support and social structure and division of labor really set us on a totally different path than all of the other animals. And another way I like to put it is, most animals can learn, but we're the only animal that teaches intentionally. Other animals can watch each other and learn that way, but we're the only animal that says, sit down, I'm going to teach you how to do this. You know, so we have some uniqueness that really set us on a different path. And it means that evolution, we don't live or die based on how good our body works anymore. So no, I don't think we're gonna fix any of our problems in terms of evolution. However, what we've now done is we now have the ability to fix our problems with technology and culture. Again, this goes back really far. You know, one example I use is there's a fossil called the Old Man of Dmanisi. So it's a skull, and it's 2.5 million years old, and he has no teeth at all. He's an old man. The fossil's from an old man, and it's Homo erectus, so it's not fully human, not modern human. But he has no teeth, but his jawbone has healed. So he lived with no teeth for at least 2 years. That's the degree of healing that we see in his bones, in the jawbone. And this was before fire had been cultivated. So here's a man who lived without being able to chew any food, which means the kind of food that they were eating, you cannot live without teeth. So the only explanation is that other people in the group were chewing his food for him. They were chewing the food and sharing it with him. Why would they do that to this, you know, this obvious burden on the group? He didn't even have teeth, but they shared with him. The reason why is that he was not a burden to the group. He had something that was important for the group. What he had was knowledge and wisdom. The old people are our reservoir of cultural knowledge. They ensure that we transmit knowledge through the generations. And now we write everything down. We have books and libraries and the internet and everything else. But for a long time, oral traditions and oral histories, even before language, the teaching of skills and knowing where to find food and how to do that, that was the old people were the reservoir of knowledge. And so we've been solving our problems in different ways for a very long time, millions of years, not just since civilization. And so so this old man was allowed to live with no teeth. And it's the same thing now. So now cystic fibrosis, it used to kill you very young. Now we've managed it so that you live to reproductive age. And I have a friend from college with cystic fibrosis, and he has children. So he's passing on. We're not weeding cystic fibrosis out. And we are this close to actually curing it genetically. So, you know, we've gradually got to the point where we're going to be fixing this problem without waiting for nature to fix the problem by letting people die. Instead, we're going to save those people and we're going to fix them. And so we are going to keep improving as a species through deliberate interventions. And I know everyone gets a little freaked out by that. They're like, oh my gosh, we're going to have like designer genetics. And just remember, that is way far away. Fixing cystic fibrosis means tweaking one gene. And in fact, actually one nucleotide of one gene. And you don't have to do it in the whole body. You just have to do it with some cells of the lungs and some cells in your intestines, which are very accessible actually for intervention. So that is a world of difference than engineering someone to be taller, for example. Because do you know how many genes are involved in human height? We're not exactly sure, but we know there's at least 800 genes that affect human height, and you would have to, throughout the whole body, affect those. I mean, and we also know that that's only about 25% of the genetics of human height are those 800 genes that we know about, which means there's probably another 2,400 genes that we don't know about yet that influence human height. The point is that we're never going to be able to fix all those genes or tweak all those genes and all the cells of the body. We are so far away from making people taller. And that's just taller. Think about attractiveness or intelligence or anything that's way more complex than height. So I am not at all worried about designer baby and designer genetics and all of that, at least for 2 generations or so. When that technology is there, then we can have the conversation. Right now, the technology on gene editing is looking at a single gene, and we're going to cure people with cystic fibrosis and with sickle cell disease and muscular dystrophy and hemophilia. Some of the very, what we call simple genetic diseases or monogenic genetic diseases, meaning a single gene is involved. We're going to be able to fix those relatively soon, and that'll be a good thing for our species. And hopefully we'll be able to fix them even early enough in life that they never cause any problem.
Well, that's a great summary. Thank you. Moving on a bit of discussion about science communication, it was mentioned on Wikipedia that you had recently recovered from COVID, and we know how the COVID situation in terms of science engagement and public misinformation has been in the US. And there's all this debate whether you should trust the scientists or you should trust the president and so on. So what, as a scientist, do you think about the situation, or what scientists could do in such a situation?
It's so frustrating. It is so frustrating because you have people, I'm not an infectious disease expert by any means, but you have people who spend their whole life studying infectious diseases and studying respiratory illnesses, infectious respiratory illnesses. And they study how they spread in populations, and they devote their whole career to this, and they study it all over the world. And they try to educate the public. And then some ignoramus on YouTube tells them masks are worse, and people believe it. And it's really frustrating that in this day and age, science has done so much for us, and people are just ready to give up on it. And I don't understand why either. They'll seize on. I'm very confused about why, because the science on COVID is still developing, but we know a lot about how it is transmitted. And I give the example of I have 2 friends who live in Taiwan, and Taiwan has dealt with epidemics of respiratory infectious disease, and so they know what to do. When COVID first broke in Taiwan, they went into a lockdown. They have a mask culture, so they know how to use masks, and they know what social distancing means. And they have a culture that when the government says, hey, we need to lock down, everyone works from home, bars and restaurants are closed for a while, the whole thing dies down, and then they're back. Within 6 weeks, Taiwan was back to normal. The lockdown was over, except for international flights being banned because they don't want it coming back. Everything in Taiwan was totally normal. And the US is still getting worse. And so the scientific answer is so simple. Wear a mask and stay away from other people for a few weeks or a few months at most, and this will subside, but people won't do it. And it's even gotten to the point where the hero of the ignoramuses is Donald Trump. I mean, he is the king leader of this concept of being skeptical of expertise. There's a very anti-intellectual movement in the United States where experts are just not trusted. If you declare yourself an expert, you are mistrusted. Oh, we don't trust experts. If you know a lot, then we don't like you. And Donald Trump is the king of that. He's capitalized on that, of saying, because everyone knows that he doesn't know about anything, but he claims he does. And he walks into the CDC and goes, I have a good mind for this stuff. I just know it naturally. And they believe him. So now they have a mascot for their contempt for knowledge, for their contempt for experts, and their contempt for education. and their mascot got COVID himself, and it doesn't seem to have mattered. So I don't know. It's so frustrating. I don't know what else could happen. I think even if he had gotten really sick and died, I don't think it would change people's mind anymore. It's now become this whole big thing. So I don't know what has to happen. Every time I think I have it figured out, something new happens where I realize it was even worse than I thought. But I think the real disease that connects to the other disease, I mean, the disease is racism, of course, and white supremacy. The disease is nationalism, of course. Personally, I think there's other diseases we can talk about, but connected to all that is anti-intellectualism. This idea of people learning and knowing a lot about something, and then that makes them expertise. And I've often said, it doesn't mean that everybody doesn't have a right to their opinion, but not all opinions are of equal weight. When someone spends their lifetime studying something, I'm sorry, their opinion is worth more on that thing. It's not worth more on other things. There's lots that I know very little about the political history of South Asia, for example, since I'm speaking with the South Asian audience here. Every single person here knows more about the politics of your region. So I don't expect you to take my opinion as worth anything. But I do know a lot about the human genome. And I'm sorry, I think my opinion is worth more in that one area. It's worth a lot less in tons of other areas. And I said, like, my mechanic, when I go to take my car in to get it fixed, I don't argue with him. He's like, oh, your alternator is broken. I don't think it's that. I don't argue. Why would I? He knows what he's doing. He does this all day, every day. I don't think I'm better than him because I'm an academic and he's a mechanic. I think I know things that he doesn't, and he knows things that I don't. But for some reason, some professions that are more seen as more intellectual, people mistrust them, that they want to hate on intellectualism in general. And science is wrapped up in that. It used to be that it was history professors and English professors. And they're like, who cares about English professors? They don't know anything about anything that matters. Now it's all forms of expertise. And science got caught in it, even though, science is what the technology in their pockets, their phones that we all love, science brought them that. The same science that tells them that the world is 13 billion, or the universe is 13 billion years old, is the same technology that created the phone, but they'll accept the phone and they won't accept the age of the earth, or the universe, excuse me. So I don't know the answer anymore.
Yes, well, as Niloy said in the chat comment, that anti-intellectualism is essentially everywhere. And being in the UK, I can give you an example which is not related to science, but you know that UK is going through Brexit. And when all the finance experts were saying that UK is going to suffer severely, our finance minister went onto TV and said the country has enough of experts.
Yeah.
So that's essentially everywhere. But who do you think has the more power or responsibility in changing this trend? Is it the media or is it the scientists themselves who can actually do something?
I wish I had the answer. I think that scientists, more of us should should spend part of our time educating the public and educating our at least our family and friends, without being dismissive, but trying to explain. We should all do more of that. And I think we need to strengthen science education in this country and in all countries, but also change how it's done, because science education for so long has been about just dump facts on people and ask them to memorize it and spit it back, when really what we should be teaching about is how science works, how science thinking, what scientific thinking is, what it means to try to remove bias from your analysis, recognizing that humans are always going to be biased. We always have bias, but that's why science is a process that's bigger than the individuals. We take all this effort with our statistics and other analyses to remove the subjectivity of the scientist and replace it with the objectivity of instruments and statistics and the community as a whole, and try to teach people about that and why that is a trustworthy process. It doesn't mean it's a perfect process, but it's trustworthy, meaning that science doesn't get it right every time, but that it circles in on the truth. It zeroes in on the correct truth. The earliest version of the truth needs some work. It needs some perfection and refinement. And that's why, people in the United States, the very first thing that the CDC was saying was don't use masks when COVID first came to the United States. But, and that's all the public heard was you don't need a mask. What they were saying was we have a shortage of masks and first responders need them. And if they don't have them and we can't protect the healthcare workers, then we're really in trouble. So please don't buy up all the masks because we need them in the hospitals. And then after the weeks and months went on and the supply grew, and then we said, okay, now there's enough, everybody go get whatever mask you can get. But then the damage had already been done. And we've learned from that since then. We won't make that mistake again. Yeah, people, so the public has to do a good job. And I think we also have to educate about how science works. That will help. Now, the media, I don't think the media is really to blame. I think the media chases sensationalist stories no matter what. So all we, I don't necessarily, I think the media is largely sort of amoral on this. I don't think they do anything intentional. I think our government leaders right now in the United States and the UK seem to be agenda driven, and they will only educate the public in ways that they think are politically beneficial to them, rather than educating the public in ways that will keep us safe. And for some reason, keeping us safe isn't politically a benefit. Why that is true, I don't know. That's who I want to trust the most in my leaders, is who I think is going to be giving me the real story that we need to be safe. But in this country, we've always valued wealth over people in the United States. It's always been a wealth-driven culture. And so right now, people see individual safety and the growth of wealth as at odds, and we're going to choose wealth over people every time in this country until we learn our lesson, and we haven't yet, clearly. But that might be changing, because the young people, if you're age 30 and younger, you have suffered so much, not just with COVID, but with everything going on from the financial crisis of 2008 till now. We have seen that the relentless pursuit of wealth over wellness has caused a lot of suffering, and it's also closed off opportunities for young people. And so as that population matures into the politically active force that they have now become, I'm hopeful. I think young people in the United States get it. And so I hate to say this, but generational change, it's the euphemism for the old people have to die, will bring better politics in this country, and a more globally minded country too, because the internet has connected young Americans with their counterparts in other countries in a way that no other generation was. I'm a college professor, so I teach, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, and they can all name people from countries that I didn't even know existed when I was their age. They have friends that they've never met in person, but they met online, and followers. And so they don't think of these faraway countries as just not our concern anymore. They think of them as their friends, because we're on this planet together. You can't, pollute the environment and say, well, it's our country, it won't go anywhere else. Please. It's like urinating in a pool. It goes everywhere. It doesn't stay. When you pollute with carbon dioxide, the whole world pays the price. And so we have a very globally minded young people in the United States. And unfortunately, they don't vote in high enough numbers yet. It's always the case where young people don't vote and old people always vote. And so we get those kind of politics, the politics that matters to old people. But the young people are fired up in a new way right now. And I see I've been teaching young kids for a long time, not young kids, young adults. And I see much more political urgency and interest in voting and getting their friends to vote than I've ever seen before. So I'm very hopeful. But we're going to find out in about 4 weeks, about 3 weeks, actually 3 weeks from Tuesday, we'll find out. That's the first real test of the young generation. Will they vote, and will they help get rid of the worst world leader that we've had in the world, in my opinion, since Hitler killed himself? I think we have the worst world leader right now, and we need to remove him. And I prefer that it be peacefully and democratically, but we have to remove him. I mean, Donald Trump is not just a threat to my country; he's a threat to every country, peace and stability. And he would burn it all down if he could. He really does. He does not care about anyone else. By the way, speaking of the UK, I had the misfortune of being in the UK during the Brexit vote because I'm a visiting faculty member at a university there, the University of Lincoln in Lincolnshire. And I happened to be there teaching my summer class that I always teach there, or that I used to. I'm actually not really active anymore because Brexit killed the program that I was teaching in because it was funded by the EU. Anyway, and it was a really strange thing to be in another country and watch them do a self-inflicted wound that and my country, I'm used to my own country doing that. It was weird watching another country commit such a self-inflicted wound. It was such an obvious mistake that was going to hurt the country. And the other thing that was weird about it for me as a visitor was that the university, like most universities, was very much against Brexit. So all of my colleagues, both the students and the professors, but Lincolnshire is in a conservative part of the country. And so when I would leave the university and interact with the community, they were all for it and they were celebrating after the vote. So I had this very dizzying experience of stepping on the university and everybody's depressed and like, oh my God, what's going to happen? And then out, everyone's celebrating that they took their country back. And remember, this was before Donald Trump was elected. I didn't realize it at the time, but it was the same dynamics at play. I should have noticed. I was like, this is what's about to happen in my country. Essentially, Brexit and Trump were the same kind of, desperation by, colonial powers, seeing their power slip away and, not being able to just bully the world into whatever we want anymore. And we're angry. And there is a real deep-seated sense in British culture that Britain is the light, that the English, they are the most civilized, and I get caught up in it myself because, I live in a former colony. And this idea that they were the light of the world and we were all so lucky to be colonized by them so that we could be brought out. It's like, and that thinking infects all of our minds. And I'm an American, so I catch myself thinking that way too, that, oh, our way is the best way, of course, or else we wouldn't be so powerful, and it's a virus of the mind, and it spreads like a virus. So, and I wish I knew the answer.
Khan Osman had a question.
Hey, Dr. Lentz, thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure.
I guess you answered the question I was going to ask already a little. I see the problem is when someone spreads pseudoscience, they tend to cite one or two articles or work on that among the hundreds of the other results and citations. You can find a peer-reviewed article on anti-vaccine, on hydroxychloroquine being used for treating coronavirus, although that has been pulled out of the journal recently. Also anti-GMO and stuff. So people, it's very easy to confuse the general people by citing one or two of those articles. I guess your answer would be teaching people how science works and what is scientific, what should we take as fact from the citations and what we should not. We should look at all those. Your comments on this?
It's a great question, and it's a tough issue because there isn't a simple formula to say, well, you count up the articles on this side and count up the articles on that side, and whichever one has more. It's not as simple as that. I wish it were. There isn't a simple formula to figure out what's true when you have competing theories or competing ideas. And so, and in fact, actually, there are plenty of stories in science where the leading trend was in one direction, and there was a lot of data that was being interpreted, in one way, and then one really good study caused all of that to be thrown away, and then it looked in another way. And of course, critics like to use those examples and say, well, everybody thought this and now they think that. So this could be another example of that. And And in a simple sense, they're correct that science can correct itself. It can, as new data comes in, you have to try to step back and see what are the motivations of the interpretations, because ultimately data is just meaningless without interpretation, right? It's just noise that you have to see the interpretation of, and it is impossible to remove your bias from the art of interpretation. So what we do in science to sort of hedge against that is we use the community, right? So we have peer review, but we also have other ways that the community critiques itself. And we've always placed a value on being skeptical. When you present your work at conferences, especially if it's something new, like of course it should always be new, but something in a new area or taking out a new claim, you can expect a lot of not hostile questions, but really skeptical questions. You have to really build your case if you're going to say something new. And that skepticism, that refusing to believe anything until the data is there to support it, is our best protection against bad science. But it's not foolproof. It is not foolproof. And it's worse than ever right now because there's so much data that's available to all of us at our fingertips. And in fact, I just was working on an article this morning for a magazine called Skeptical Inquirer. And my closing point is that in the era of genomics, where DNA sequencing, we have the full genomes of thousands of different species now, and literally millions of individuals. And that's a lot of data that is available for someone to misinterpret. If you want to, you can use that data in lots of different ways that's not appropriate, and you can point to it, and it's very easy to do that. So what we have to do is come up with ways to balance that, where we use that wealth of data and say, okay, yes, you can cherry pick data points that tell another story, but what does the totality of the data say? You have to look at all of it at once and make your best interpretation there. And that's why when I advise undergraduate students that they pursue data science or information science as part of their education, the ability, the science of taking large data sets and trying to understand what it's telling us. That is, I think, the most important area of research right now is data science, of how to take massive amounts of data and understand what the truth is that it's telling us. Because if you interpret it incorrectly, it's very easy to get a different picture. But what you're getting at with your question is, I think, the biggest problem we face right now, at least in terms of how the science and the public, how the public can make use of science. Because ultimately science should be serving the public. That's what we do. I think scientists who don't like to bother explaining to the public why they do what they do, I don't think that's appropriate. I think you owe the public an answer to why you're doing it, because you're taking their money to do it. I mean, it's ultimately public money and public investment in science and research, and it should be in service of society and of individuals. So it should never be seen as a bother to explain why you're doing it, or what you found even. And that's why I think also all journals should be freely and open access. And I don't care how we pay for it. Pay for it whichever way you want, but journals should not be should be behind paywalls, because that's the public's money that went into that research, and the public deserves right to that data and to the conclusion. So the publishing industry needs to change, I think. I don't know if that'll help though, to be honest. It could make it worse, because you're giving people access to more data that they could misinterpret.
Right. And also, I don't know how much you can influence the public by just saying that science says this.
Right.
Like, can you influence an election? For example, during the last election, more than 100 Nobel laureates actually sided for Hillary Clinton. But even though she got more votes than Donald Trump, he won. And also during this election, Scientific American, for the first time in their history, sided towards Biden. And also the New England Journal of Medicine editorial recently published, they also say that, okay, we need to remove this leader because he's harmful for the people, for the science, and for America. Are you hopeful that the scientific community can influence the general public on voting for science towards a candidate who will support science?
I don't know. This isn't an area where I'm an expert. I think that there's a sociology of this that I am not well versed in. What I will say is I think that there's very little value in scientists and science organizations endorsing candidates. I agree with you that it didn't matter if every single Nobel Prize winner says to vote for Biden. I don't think that will help. However, what prominent scientists can do is speak on the issues and rebut the poor claims of the issues. And so, for example, there's a common trope in the United States and probably the UK as well, that where immigrants come, crime comes with them. So when immigrants come into a neighborhood, crime follows. Either they're committing the crime, or the implication is that they're criminals, or there will be criminals. And some people are saying, oh, it's just because they're poor, but still blah, blah, blah. There's all this. Well, we know actually that with one exception, that's actually not true. So in the United States, there are people who study crime and immigration and the connections thereof. And the majority of immigration is by families, not by individuals. And in those cases, pretty much across the board in the United States, immigration lowers crime in communities, provided that the immigrants are connected to families, which most immigration in the United States is of families, not of individuals. And when families of any kind move into a neighborhood, they lower crime rates. The only time when immigration in the United States leads to an increase in crime is when you have unconnected young men. So when unconnected young men move into a neighborhood, crime goes up. But that's true for native-born as well. That has nothing to do with their immigration status. It has to do with the fact that unconnected young men are about the most dangerous individuals you can find in any population. Is unpaired, a young man without a strong social group is just a dangerous individual. I'm sorry to say that young men are the biggest dangers. So the reason I tell you that story is that that's an example of how science can actually inform public policy without taking a position on a candidate. I said everything I just said there without mentioning Trump, without mentioning Biden, without mentioning the Democrats or Republicans. I just said the science on this is very clear, and I can point you to the studies because I interviewed an expert on this. I can point you to the studies that show that immigration, particularly when it's families, lowers crime in local communities, because immigrants do not want the attention of law enforcement. They do not want to end up in jail. They are searching for a better life, and they have families. And so especially if there's economic opportunity for them to work, that's what immigrants want. They want the same thing that we all want, except for they want it usually a little more desperately because they've moved from one part of the world to another. So by definition, they are eager for a place in society. They're not disgruntled. And so, except when it's young men, which is true even when native-borns move around. So unconnected young men raise crime, but families do not. Families lower it. That is not a political statement. That is a sociologically studied data point. So I think that's what science can do, is take issues that people vote on, and rather than saying Biden's better, saying here's what the data show. You make your own conclusion about what kind of policy you want. But if you don't want immigrants moving into your neighborhood, just know that you're passing up on the chance to have a lower crime rate. So when that Muslim family moves into your neighborhood, they pray differently than you do, they look differently than you do, but they are not going to commit crimes because they want the same peaceful existence that you have. Maybe go to picnic with them rather than putting up a Trump sign, and you'll find that your life is better too. And that's a non-political statement, in my opinion.
Professor Lentz, we are slightly over the scheduled 1 hour time.
Oh, yeah. Ooh, you're right.
Can we request you to stay with us for 5-10 minutes more?
Sure. Yeah, I can give you a few more minutes.
Thank you. So going back to the discussion that we were having about behavior in the sense of nationalism, we have a question on Facebook which kind of is relevant for behavioral genetics, that is asking, is there any connection between this kind of irrational nationalism and genetics?
So let me make sure. So is there a genetics of like nationalism and the, is that what we're kind of getting at? Like,
the question isn't entirely clear, but it's also asked if that can bring any kind of change in other people's behavior.
okay. So from a genetic point of view, I don't know. I don't think so. But let me tell you a little bit about nationalism and xenophobia. So what we have as a species is the same thing that most species have, most social species, which is a tendency to center ourselves in a community, right? A group of some kind. And so we are programmed biologically to seek a group and seek membership in a group. However, but that group is in opposed to another group. So that's called othering. So for a community to work, not everybody is in it, or else it's not a community anymore. Community is a self-selected group of some kind. So we have a tendency, a natural tendency, to associate with the group at the exclusion of non-group members. However, we don't have a tendency to identify that group by race or skin color or even national flag. That is what exists, and so that's how we do it. But there's nothing programmed about that. So there's a solution. First of all, forming community that's not strictly tied to country of origin would be really helpful. The other thing is intergroup contact. So having friendly contact, especially when you're young, between members that are clearly not in your group in one way or another, having that friendly contact builds empathy across groups rather than competition. So if you never meet anyone that doesn't look any different than you, and then you grow up that way, you will forever have what's called an empathy gap with people who don't look like you, because you never develop that tendency to develop empathy for other kinds of people. So what I like about this, it's sad in a sense that this is the reality we have. Racism, xenophobia, nationalism, this is baked into our DNA. We have a natural tendency to find a group, associate with that group, and to dislike other groups. Animals do that too, right? Chimpanzee groups will fight each other to the death, right? So they identify with a group and there's intergroup conflict. This is who we are. That's always going to be there as part of our psychology. But the solution is also there too, and that's developing empathy across groups. So there are chimpanzees that are able to work past their conflict, and there are humans, as we know, that can work past their conflict. But we have to do it intentionally. We have to want our children to not be nationalistic, and then take the measures so that they won't be. But right now, a lot of people raise their children with this America first ideology, right? We train our kids to love their country and hate other countries, or at least by implication, think less of other countries. So as long as that continues, this problem isn't going to go anywhere. But if we teach our children to think of ourselves as, this is your community, this is your group, you find strength and solidarity here, and this is another group that's just as equally good, and they're trying to do the same thing we're trying to do, and we can be partners and we can work together. So if you raise your children in that global sense that we're all the same and trying to do the same things, this is fixable. But it's social engineering, right? But we're always engineering. That's how public school works. We engineer our kids to think and do certain things, and so we can build that empathy. We can capitalize on our tendency to develop empathy for others as kids, and that's the only thing that'll save us, I think.
I'll wrap up with two last questions. So a lot of our viewers wanted to know if your book's translation rights are available for Bengali language.
In what language?
Bengali.
I was contacted by someone who asked if they could get the rights to translate into Bengali. But I don't negotiate that myself. There's somebody that does that, and I haven't heard, which means probably it hasn't happened yet. But we generally approve all the requests as long as we can, as long as the fee that they're paying is enough for my person's trouble. I always tell them to say yes, say yes, say yes. Even if it's like a really low amount, I'll say, then fine, I don't need my part of it. Just I'd love to see it as many languages as possible. So if you know any publishers that do translations, tell them to get in contact with me, and I'll tell my agent to please negotiate this and make it happen, even if it means I have to take less. I don't care about getting paid at this point. I would much rather see the book in as many languages as possible.
Great, thanks. So my last question to you would be for our audience, because a lot of our audience are young scientists or science students in these developing nations. So, and a lot of them actually aspire to become like you in the sense that they want to grow up and be a researcher as well as a science communicator. So from that perspective, what advice could you give them?
Well, the best advice I have is to read widely. And so, because a lot of scientists I know, they're very good at reading the literature in their field and writing their discipline. They read what they need to know to be successful there, but they don't read outside of it. And so I'm always reading a book or two, and I read stuff in my area, of course, but I also read all kinds of different things. And the best way to be a good writer is to be a reader, to read a lot. And so, because you can remember what it was like to not know something and then be educated by a book, and you can and try to read it with an eye of, is this good writing? Is this clear? How could this have been improved? So just read a lot, spend a lot of your day reading. And I tell my students that too, because a lot of them just want to be active and doing something all the time. I said, but you should really read for an hour or two every day, and find things that you like to read so that it doesn't feel like work. But I read popular science, and I'll read it in physics. I'll read history. I read, I'm not so good on the arts. I probably should read more in the arts and humanities. But I read a lot of biographies. I read a lot of history. I read a lot of outside of my area, like physics and chemistry, and I think that makes you well-rounded as a scientist. You know a little bit about a lot of different things, and so it helps also you clarify your own ideas and about where they fit. So my best advice is to read a lot, and then just start writing, and don't worry about the audience just yet. Eventually, you have to work on finding an audience. But I think if you think about that first, you'll never get started, or at least you'll get started in a very pigeonholed way. So don't think about the audience at first. You'll eventually have to do that. But first, just write. Just get your stuff out there. Start a blog. It's free. Anybody can start a blog, and it's free. Write about it, send it to people, see what people think, and don't think that you're writing it for anybody but yourself. You're writing it to practice. You're writing it to clarify your own thoughts. You're writing it to see, how it all looks and how it all sounds. Don't worry about the audience, or else if it doesn't get enough reads, then you'll be like, oh, this was pointless. It's not pointless because you did it for yourself. And if you set a goal to write one blog post each week, and just to get your stuff out there. And then after 6 months, go back to your oldest stuff and see how it sounds. And you'll be like, wow, that's terrible. I'm so much better now. You'll see progress the more you do it. And you'll realize that's why you were writing it, not to change anyone's mind or teach anybody, to develop your own process for writing, your own skills. And you only get better by doing it. And also, the biggest writing, I teach a science writing class, or I'm about to. The biggest practical skill I have on writing is to always outline first. Even some emails, I start with an outline. Like, these are the main points. This is how important they all are, comparative to each other, how much time I want to spend on each one. I really organize my thoughts, at least the skeleton of an outline, and then I start writing. If you just sit down and start writing, you will meander all throughout and lose your focus easily. So I always start with an outline. That's a practical tip. Oh, I think you're muted. I'm not hearing anything.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
So I was just wrapping up by thanking you for sharing your time with us and this very interesting discussion. We'll look forward to your next book.
Okay, great. Well, thanks very much for having me. I enjoyed this, and good luck, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.